Okay, so Dr. Flora Matheson is going to be our next speaker. So a little bit about Dr. Matheson. Dr. Flora Matheson leads the Justice and Equity Research program located at the MAP Center for Urban and Health Solutions, St. Michael Hospital. Her research focuses on solutions to reduce social and health inequities amongst people experiencing problem with gambling, imprisonment. Solutions are built with and for these communities. As a sociologist, she uses both gender and social determinants of health and lens to enact changes. So Dr. Matheson, please take over. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to let my other two colleagues who are speaking with me introduce themselves as well. Nicoletta, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nicoletta Curson. I'm invited to the conference by Justice Kofi Barnes. I'd like to thank him and the Association of Justice and Treatment Professionals. I've been working as a peer researcher on a variety of studies with Dr. Flora Matheson and Arthur, as well as the rest of the team that's not present today. And today we'll be talking about traumatic brain injury and conditions of release. Thank you.
I'm Arthur McLuhan. I'm a senior research associate on the team working with Flora and Nicoletta and the rest of the team on these issues, important issues, an important stream of research around incarceration, health, and reentry.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm just going to share my slides. Just bear with me a moment. There, is that clear?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great, thank you. So we're going to talk about traumatic brain injury and the criminal justice system. Sorry, my throat is bad today, so bear with me. I'll skip past these. We have 3 learning objectives for you today. We're going to learn about traumatic brain injury, its prevalence and risk factors for criminal justice involvement. We're going to learn about supervision and conditions challenges for people with traumatic brain injury. And we're going to learn about the relationships between IPV and TBI in the context of conditions. I'm going to start us off for objective 1. We'll start with a definition. So TBI is a damage to the brain. It's caused by an external force, such as a blow to the head. It can be a penetrating force or a non-penetrating force. Likely causes of brain injury could be a fall, a motor vehicle accident, or a sports injury. We know that there are significant cognitive, behavioral, physical, and emotional challenges for individuals who've sustained a TBI, and TBIs can be anywhere from mild to very severe. And so the extent of the challenge that people experience or the symptoms depends on the extent of the damage to the brain. We also know it's a hidden or invisible disability. You can't see it on the outside, but it's there and it's causing challenges for people. There's no obvious outside or outward signs of disability, and the symptoms can be seen rather than as a disability, but as other illnesses. Maybe you may see people and think that they have a mental health concern, or it could be that we see it as character traits if someone is always aggressive. So keep that in mind. There are 4 major domains, symptom domains for TBI: communication, emotion, behavior, and cognitive cognition. Under communication, there are things like whether people can listen intently to a conversation, and if they have problems speaking or engaging in conversation or thinking. In the behavioral domain, it's things like impulse control. Can they contain their emotions? Are there changes in affect? Like, do they have a heightened response to stressful situations, or they lack affect? They don't have a response at all. In terms of cognition, things like attention, being able to pay attention, be able to remember things, being able to process and reason. So these are all things around cognition that can be symptoms of a traumatic brain injury. And then finally, there's emotion. So heightened or blunted emotional response, or depression or anxiety. So living in the environment we do in the research world, we know that traumatic brain injury is very prevalent among people in jails and prisons, but not everybody is aware of that. But the rates are actually quite staggering. They actually do range. There's been quite a few studies done on prevalence, and they range anywhere from about 30% up to 80%. In one sample, it was 100% that was based on a particular set of individuals. But just to know that it's a very high rate in our prison systems, which means that we actually have people in the system with a health injury that is not being addressed. Okay. So just a little bit more on research. We also know from research that people in prison can have multiple brain injuries. So there's maybe not just one, but they may have several. We know that the counts are underestimated. My lab did a study with people who worked in the sex trade and with people who identified as women, and pretty much all of the participants had at least one head injury in their history, and quite severe head injuries. Many didn't seek help. Many didn't think they needed to seek help, but they also were uncomfortable seeking help because there's a lot of stigma associated with sex work and criminal activity, and also with drug use. And so the women really didn't feel comfortable in healthcare settings because there's a lot of stigma against them. Just tell you about a couple of studies that we did in Ontario. We did, this is with federal data, so people serving 2 or more years, sentences of 2 or more years. We looked at a cohort of men and women aged 18 to 28, so a very young cohort who sustained a TBI. We compared those with the same aged people, men and women, who hadn't sustained a TBI. Then we looked in federal correction records to see what the rates of incarceration were. And the rates of incarceration for people with TBI in this age bracket were 2.5 times more likely, greater than those who didn't have a TBI. So that's very striking. The rate of incarceration for people with TBI, especially in that age range, is a very young age, just starting out in life. And then we also looked at men and women 18 plus who sustained a TBI and who are in prison. So those who were in prison with a TBI and those in prison without a TBI. And we wanted to look at serious disciplinary charges. And we found that those with a TBI had 14 times more likely, were more likely to have a serious disciplinary charge. And so this is disturbing in the sense that those charges can lead to repercussions in terms of maybe sentence length, adding on to the sentence length, or not being able to meet parole conditions. So studies also show that TBI increases risk of return to custody. You can see the number here in this one study. And we also know that the Centers of Disease Control in the US, they've identified TBI among prison and jail populations as a significant public health problem and something that we should consider in Canada, but haven't done so yet. I just want to go over a little bit about women in the justice system with TBI. We know that approximately 70% of women in prison have a traumatic brain injury, and those who have, and women who are convicted of a violent crime, they're more likely to have occurred traumatic previous or pre-crime, traumatic brain injury or some other form of physical abuse. So that's the implications of that are, concerning. And then women with substance use disorders have increased risk for TBI in comparison to women in the general US population. So we know that TBI is associated with a host of challenges across the domains we reviewed just a few minutes ago. These in cognition, emotion, behavior, and communication, and it makes it difficult for people in everyday social interactions. But what are the consequences of these challenges in criminal justice settings? Here, I'm going to read you a quote which provides insight into these challenges. So the trajectory of criminal justice involvement from interactions with the police, the frontline workers, probation and parole officers, to formal proceedings such as bail and court trials involves complex social interactions and, I would say, social communication that typically require high level and fast-paced processing of information, understanding, and responding. So there are various concerns about when people come, for example, into a bail hearing or into a court trial, and they have a traumatic brain injury, and maybe they can't process information quickly. The legalese in the courtroom is there's a lot of it, and even the general population often it has trouble following it. But if you have memory issues, if you have problems understanding social communication in everyday context, then those settings are going to be very difficult for people. It's going to put them in a situation where they may be agreeing to something that they shouldn't be agreeing to. Maybe they're going to plead guilty without really understanding why, what the implications of that are. So something to consider. And the last thing I want to leave you with, just for this little 101 on traumatic brain injury in the criminal justice system, is this idea of misconceptions of people with TBI in the criminal justice system. So those challenges that we've talked about, those symptom domains, think about that in terms of, meeting someone in the prison system who has a traumatic brain injury, and their behavior is different than what you would expect or what you would want in that behavior based on the rules and regulations of the correctional setting. So TBI symptoms can often be misinterpreted as non-compliance, rudeness, defiance, poor motivation, disengagement, and aggression. And all of these can create an even more volatile situation for the person in the criminal justice system, because their behavior is a result of a health issue, and it's not recognized as that. And there's also evidence that there's limited awareness and common misperceptions of TBI prevalence and challenges among supervision officers, and that may contribute to poor supervision outcomes. So with that 101, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Arthur, and he's going to talk you through supervision condition challenges.
Yes, I'm not sure if this makes it 102, but let's start with community supervision conditions, challenges, and those challenges in the context of having a TBI. Next slide. So community supervision in Canada. The number of individuals under community supervision exceeds the number in custody in correctional facilities in many jurisdictions internationally, including in Canada, where the number of adults under federal, provincial, and/or territorial community supervision is more than 2.5 times the number in custody on any given day. Although community supervision is intended to enhance reentry outcomes, providing a structured and guided, supervised reintegration, meta-analyses suggest that it has largely been ineffective in reducing rates of recidivism. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry, there. Community supervision places people under restrictive conditions, such as orders to abstain from substance use, to regularly report to a probation or parole officer, to attend treatment, to find employment, to avoid particular places, geographical areas. Being under conditions increases the risk and consequences of accumulating further sanctions and returning to custody via technical violations and administrative charges related to failure to comply with conditions. Community supervision, scholars argue, thus functions as a net widening rather than penal reduction mechanism. So increasingly, scholars are arguing that we're moving from mass incarceration to a system of mass supervision, and the consequences of which are just starting to be explored. One of those areas that is a recent area of focus is how people experience and manage conditions, supervision conditions in their everyday lives, including the interactional work within social relationships required to manage the practical challenges of complying with conditions. So you may need to negotiate a relationship with the surety under whose authority you are staying by court order and abiding by those house rules. And you also need to navigate relationships with probation parole officers. Managing conditions is a complex social process involving multiple situated actors in the criminal justice system and the social worlds of those under supervision. The perspectives, practices, and interactions between those under conditions and control agents, such as police, judges, lawyers, probation, parole officers, as well as third parties, such as family, friends, and other community members. All of these relationships contribute to the experiences, trajectories, and outcomes of community supervision. And those actors and stakeholders operate in multiple as well as intersecting contexts: personal, social, organizational, institutional. And these contexts really shape the meaning and experience of supervision, how people approach it, how they approach breaches, how they approach sanctions. The fact that conditions, the everyday experience of conditions, is an interpretive, interactional, contextual process means not only that people define and respond to conditions in different ways, but also that these differences can reinforce inequality. The burden of conditional restrictions may be shouldered, for example, by those most vulnerable populations who will find making bail and meeting conditions most difficult. They also tend to receive, these populations tend to receive more conditions with higher levels of restriction, the terms of which often fail to take into account their context: social relationships, material hardships, health challenges, which prohibit their involvement with the very people, places, and things that had comprised the lived realities of these populations in dealing with disadvantage. The result of this lack of context being brought into inform conditions, the setting, applying, and enforcing conditions, results in poor condition-related outcomes, such as returning to custody, increasing criminalization and marginalization. And so, for example, there are some gender differences and dimensions to community supervision that are starting to be explored in the literature. Women who face incarceration experience significant social and personal challenges under supervision relative to men. For example, the typical incarcerated woman is a person facing mental illness, problematic substance use, economic marginalization, single motherhood, and a history of violent victimization. Increasingly more racialized women face incarceration, and women with relatively complex histories are more likely to return to custody for parole suspensions. Women's familial orientations and roles introduce competing demands during supervision as mothers, partners, providers, where these family reintegration efforts are contrary to or compete with supervision demands, expectations, and definitions of success. Next slide, please. Similarly, relationships with control agents are also important to women's experiences under supervision, with research indicating, for example, that the relationship style of probation and parole officers plays a role in women's success under community supervision. Women with a supportive supervisor experience less anxiety and have higher crime avoidance self-efficacy. For women with characteristics that predict recidivism, a supportive style is highly productive for crime avoidance and self-efficacy. Next slide. Although we know that there's a high prevalence of TBI among people who experience incarceration, much less is known about the TBI-related challenges and outcomes among people under community supervision, but it is an emerging area of work. There is strong evidence, as Flora noted, and as she has examined, that TBI history increases the risk for rule violation in prison, where people who have had a TBI relative to those without a history of TBI are more likely to be involved in violent and nonviolent behavioral infractions. such as refusing orders, possession of drugs and weapons, and incur serious disciplinary charges. Emerging evidence suggests similar challenges among those under supervision. Next slide. TBI is associated, as Flora noted, with cognitive, behavioral, and emotional and communication challenges that reduce the skills and capacities required to comply with standard conditions of probation, parole, and pretrial supervision, such as orders to abstain from substance use, attend regularly, remember to attend treatment, and to report to a supervision officer. TBI history is associated with greater risk of behavioral infractions, treatment non-adherence, and failing to appear for mandatory appointments, probation and parole violations, and revocations. Some evidence suggests also that limited awareness among probation parole officers also shapes this process. We are starting to, given the limited literature and research in the area, we are starting working with community partners. We have formed a Breaking the Cycle Solutions Network to explore and try to develop some sort of solutions to this issue. Our first initiative is a study called the Catch-22 Conditions of Community Supervision, in which we are qualitatively exploring the challenges of community supervision, the strategies for complying with conditions of community supervision among those with a history of TBI. So that work is ongoing, and if anyone's interested in it, they can reach out and we can share more about that study. Nicoletta.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about intimate partner violence in relation to traumatic brain injury and the criminalization of women. You'll be hearing me speak a lot about trauma over these next 4 days. So hopefully each presentation will be varied enough. So, you know, my talks don't become informal health breaks for you. So an overwhelming number of women experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. TBI is a serious consequence of IPV that is often overlooked and misdiagnosed. IPV encompasses physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as controlling behaviors. We already know some ways in which IPV might impact psychosocial factors. Many of the outcomes are, after all, predictable. Some of these are mental health issues, chronic or acute health problems, behavioral issues, substance use, police involvement, social isolation, neurological impairment, lack of effective problem-solving skills, poor educational performance, problem-seeking and maintaining meaningful employment, to which a criminal record, of course, contributes. So, as some of you may know that I mentioned I am a peer researcher in the project, which means I do have lived experience with some of the things we are studying, including intimate partner violence, traumatic brain injury. So just to mention for educational performance, I went to university while I was doing my bachelor. It was shortly after this relationship ended, and it was extremely difficult, and I was trying to behave as if I were normal, whatever that meant to me at the time. I was just trying to do what everybody else seemed to do in life. And I began using substances as a coping mechanism. I thought this was finally making me feel like everybody else felt, which is not such overwhelming emotions that I can't deal with basic elements of existence. And I don't have a lot of time in this presentation, so I won't go into detail with many of the other issues right now. I'm going to move on to some aspects of IPV trauma. So I think a big one, I know for me, was anger. And I didn't realize that though, because I suppressed my anger, and it resulted in mental and emotional concerns as well as substance use. Other people have different ways of expressing anger. So this may be through aggressive behavior. Again, this can be a result of IPV. It can also be a combination of TBI and IPV. one of the aspects of IPV is disconnection and isolation. So as I'm sure many of you know, your partner slowly over time disconnects you from your family, your friends, until you are completely isolated and they're the only person you have contact with for the most part. And if you do have contact with anyone else, it's very often dishonest because you're trying to conceal the fact of what's happening to you in your relationship. So substance use, again, often becomes a coping mechanism to suppress anger, pain, trauma, flashbacks, nightmares, all the things. So because we're talking in the context of the criminal justice system, I'm going to talk about IPV and police reporting as well. So it is very unlikely that a victim of IPV will self-report her abuser to the police for a variety of reasons. I think fear of retribution is probably one of the main ones, at least it was for me. I know for other women, a major issue is family, CAS involvement if they have children, sometimes financial, if they're dependent on their partner. For me, definitely, though, it was the fear of retribution, because there were many times that there was police involvement, all of the times where somebody else made the call. One time, my father called the police. I did not share with him what was going on. I tried my very best to hide it from him. But one day he saw I had a bruise and he called the police, and they told him there's nothing we can do. He insisted, and so they called my abuser, who promised he would never do it again. And they called my father and said, oh, we had a conversation with him, it won't happen again. And there were many, many other instances where strangers in the street tried to intervene, called the police, or also where my partner had an interaction with the police for a different reason. And I was there and they had an inclination of what was going on. Generally, that was because I would jump in and try to take the blame for whatever crime he was being arrested for in order to, I don't know, prove my loyalty or trustworthiness or whatever it is I was trying to prove to him, so that I would have respite from some of the abuse. And at no point in any of these interactions over 4 years was police contact helpful. It was my first experience with physical abuse. I was not abused as a child by my family. This was new to me. I was a teenager, and I didn't know that any resources existed at all. I did not know about domestic violence shelters. I did not know that you could see maybe a social worker or psychologist to discuss this. Basically, I had no idea that any resources existed. I thought that the extent of it was, you have to call the cops on this person, and the next day they'll get bail and, physically abuse you because of what you did, and that it'll be worse. So I think one of the major things that can be done is this knowledge sharing, providing resources. Police are often the first point of contact for victims of intimate partner violence. And sometimes, yes, sometimes it's family and sometimes it's friends, though, you're slowly being isolated from them and you're trying to conceal what's happening, really to protect them. Because I know for me, my friends were being threatened with violence, so I stopped talking to my friends. There were many times I tried to leave the relationship, and I I think I would have if it was just me that was under threat of violence, but then he threatened to kill my family. And because I was a young teenager, I believed that he would. So I thought, okay, I have to protect my family, my friends. And so it was extremely isolating. And so really, even though there is a lack of self-reporting to police, they generally have a good idea of what is happening, even if they can't actually lay criminal charges. So now in the context of IPV, TBI, and conditions in regard to the study, Catch-22 that we were discussing. So a lack of follow through with conditions due to TBI symptoms, such as neurological impairment or lack of insight into consequential behavior, has been mentioned by Flora and Arthur, but also conditions act as punishment or behavioral control, a deterrent to whatever criminal behavior has preceded the condition. But these conditions reinforce the abuser behavior, which is also a mechanism of control and a lack of self-determination. So conditions may also have implications for personal safety, such as having to have an address, a curfew. Your abuser, of course, will want to know these things, whether you like it or not, so they know where you are, when you are. Many of the times, at least in my case, but I know for a number of women, often they do have a male co-accused. Sometimes this male co-accused is their partner. Sometimes this partner is their abuser. So you are not allowed to have contact with your co-accused, but if you lack control over your own decision-making process of who you can and cannot see, whether you engage with your abuser or not, is not up to you. And so that you're implicitly, or you're being dragged into not following through with a condition and then ending up being, once again, punished by the system for this thing that you don't really have control over, or at least feel that you don't. So I would like to spend some time before we go into the Q&A on suggestions. I think for me, this is really the most important part of this presentation. And so some of the things that I think are important to do are taking an interdisciplinary paradigm of legal treatment and social services when responding to criminal charges against victims of intimate partner violence, or when police contact is initiated with potential victim. So whether it's in the context of the victim having committed a crime, maybe with the abuser as co-accused, or simply police contact in any other way where that dynamic is at play. So providing accessible resources to the victim that are either immediately available or available at a time when the victim chooses to engage with those resources. I know many of the times, all the times really, that there was a police contact where my partner and I were present, and there was the question of, do I want to report the physical abuse that I didn't admit to, but that the police, said they knew was occurring. So they would separate us a little bit. One police officer would be talking to me, and like a few feet down, another police officer would be talking to my partner. And really, it doesn't feel supportive of safe. It doesn't feel that, okay, if you do go ahead with self-reporting, you're going to be safe. So I think more needs to be done in this realm, where maybe it's not just the police that have this initial contact. Maybe when you're pulled away from your partner, there's some intervention with either social services, mental health professionals, some sort of treatment team, other than just a visit to the ER where you're in and out. So again, just to reinforce, providing resources. And so I think also, because self-reporting is extremely low, adopting default suspicion of abuse by legal and treatment professionals could function as an intervention tactic. Honestly, people are quite good at reading a situation, even if you believe, like I believed I was hiding it well, my partner believed that nobody would suspect him of being abusive, but actually it turns out that everybody actually knew what was going on, regardless of my multitude of excuses. So during this conference, there will be much discussion about the need for trauma-informed approaches in the justice system. This is because we as a society have become aware of the structural violence inherent in systems. So incarcerating victims of IPV and TBI reinforces trauma, marginalization, and stigmatization in an already disconnected and isolated population. I think judicially supervised treatment, like we have for drug treatment courts, mental health courts, as opposed to incarceration for current and former victims of IPV, would be of great impact and offer support to people who generally lack support. So I just want to provide a quote by Marshall McLuhan. He once wrote, "We look at the present through a rear view mirror. We march backwards into the future." He was, of course, talking about the medium of media, but also the influence of environment, the environments that we create in our societies. So let's think of the legal system and incarceration as a medium. We have had the past 130 years since the establishment of the Canadian criminal justice system and the founding of the first Canadian penitentiary in Kingston, to come to the understanding that punishment is not an effective tool for creating healthier societies, that jails do not effectively reintegrate incarcerated individuals, nor do they discourage recidivism. If anything, I believe they contribute to recidivism due to institutionalization as a chronic biopsychosocial state. So perhaps it's time we turn around and march forward into the future. Thank you.
Wow, amazing, amazing presentation. I'm just going to see if there are any questions. I think hopefully the volume was resolved. I think there was just one question. So for those who have any questions, feel free, raise your hand and click on that reactions button. And when you click on the reactions button, it is the reactions button. When you click, there's a raise hand feature. If you want to click on the raise hand feature and kind of ask any questions that you may have. But for me, my take, I think this, number one, I think this is an excellent teamwork. Dr. Matheson, Dr. McLuhan, and Nicoleta, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you for sharing these stories, because I think this is what humanizes the system, right? This is where I also teach social policy, and I tell students, there's hot knowledge and then there's cold knowledge. The hot knowledge, the cold knowledge is the knowledge of the textbook, college, universities, PhD. The hot knowledge is the knowledge of the lived experiences. And if you really truly want to make any policies inclusive, you need to combine the hot and the cold. And this is how you kind of create more inclusive policies, inclusive programs. And so this, I think, is an amazing kind of teamwork, in terms of, Dr. Matheson and Dr. McLuhan's research work, and include your lived experiences and how they all kind of intersect with each other to create policies that are humane, to create institutions, laws that are humane, that takes also into consideration the knowledge of the lived experiences. And for us, I think maybe as university educated, to kind of, for time being, park our expertise hat and kind of look and use other lenses to look at the very same policies. So amazing. Thank you. I don't know how else I can thank you. But I think this is amazing that you're able to put all the research as well as the lived experience, and this is the result of what you're hearing and seeing. Let me see if there are any hands up, any kind of questions, any comments anybody has. Unless I'm thinking maybe people are just hungry and kind of want to take a quick lunch break. But yeah, thank you. I'm also looking at the time. We are on the dot, 12:25. So let's take a quick a lunch break, 12:25, and we will come back at 2 p.m. And once again, Dr. McLuhan, Dr. Matheson, and Nicolita, thank you for this amazing presentation.
Thank you for having us, and I apologize my video won't come back on, but thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Amazing. So you please switch off your cameras, take a walk. I think I'm going to do the same. I got a park across. I'm just going to take a walk or something. Let's all reconvene at 2 o'clock. Please be logged in. Don't go anywhere, and we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. Thank you, everybody.